Good afternoon and welcome everyone. I'm Maeve Hunt, Chair of Chartered Accountants Ulster Society, and thank you for joining us today for this webinar with our legal partner A&L Goodbody. Throughout the public health crisis, A&L Goodbody have been working with us to bring the latest guidance and advice for members, member firms and local employers. Together we've tried to answer your questions on issues such as CBILS, the job retention scheme, and highlight best practice as we all try to find a way through the challenge of COVID-19. 1 year on and we still find ourselves in uncharted waters. There are still questions on which we need guidance. So today we're delighted to have Rob Tubman to discuss issues around extended furlough, the vaccine rollout, the coronavirus job retention scheme and how this impacts business. Rob is a solicitor in A&L Goodbody's employment and incentives team and advises a wide range of public and private sector clients on contentious and non-contentious aspects of employment law. He has assisted employers in the defence of claims at the Industrial and Fair Employment Tribunals and regularly advises in-house HR personnel on day-to-day issues such as grievance and disciplinary matters. Today, Rob will highlight some of the challenges that the vaccination rollout could present for UK employers, with one eye on a return to the workplace in 2021. You will get the opportunity to ask questions, so please feel free to type any in the Q&A box on the Zoom platform, but please bear in mind we cannot provide specific legal advice on a bespoke situation. With all that said, I'll hand over to Rob. Rob?
Thanks very much, Maeve, for that introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. As Maeve says, I'm a solicitor in the employment team here in A&L Goodbody in Belfast, and certainly over the last 12 months, furlough has been the topic on everyone's lips, and we've seen a really steady flow of instructions in and around that. And I suppose the focus of today's presentation is to touch on the latest on the furlough scheme, and then also, as Maeve had said, with an eye on a return to work now that the vaccine rollout is in full swing here in Northern Ireland, just touching some of the issues that employers may face as that moves on. So we'll get started. And again, that's just the running order. So I'll touch on furlough at the start, give you an indication of the latest position, some of the things employers need to be mindful of, and then we'll move on to the vaccination topic. And again, touch on some of those major issues that certainly we've identified, and some of the things that perhaps maybe aren't as apparent, but may prove problematic as things develop. And then finally, we'll have some time for questions. So as Maeve says throughout, please do put your questions in the Q&A box as we go along, and hopefully we'll be able to answer as many of those as possible for you towards the end. So just to start off on furlough, I'm sure that everyone, if not most of the people on this call, will be well familiar with the furlough scheme by now. I think on the 20th of March, we'll be a full year of the furlough scheme in its various forms and iterations. And so listen, I don't propose to go into the absolute nuts and bolts of everything that has happened in that year. But when I first sat down to think about this presentation, it was early January, and there had been some updated government guidance at the end of December. And so we were a bit more clued in as to some of the rules and even people who perhaps could be furloughed that couldn't before. And then, of course, the spring budget came, and the Chancellor announced that the furlough scheme would actually be then extended again until the 30th of September 2021. But I suppose just to go back into some detail on the original purpose of the furlough scheme, so the coronavirus job retention scheme, as it is officially known, or furlough to everyone else, originally came about 20th of March 2020, largely in response to the stay-at-home order and the almost overnight, certainly in our place, the almost overnight move to working from home for most people. And initially, it was a short-term measure. In hindsight, that was probably short-sighted. I think back then there maybe wasn't quite the understanding of the virus that there is now, and it was due to end in June 2020. And really, it was viewed as a way to avoid the need for redundancies in the immediate short term, and a way of preserving employment if at all possible. And so you had this offer of up to £2,500 per employee per month that employers could claim with a view to keeping staff on, and as I say, avoiding making them redundant. As I said at the start, since being extended numerous times, various different iterations and different rules. And as employment lawyers, I think what we struggled with at the start of all this was that furlough as a term was not a legal term. I know in America it's more of a concept, but here, at the outset, we were no better placed than our clients in terms of what this all was about. So there was a degree of mad scramble and Googling to try and get on top of the position. And I think again, most people on the call will appreciate that government guidance was coming thick and fast on this, and at outset wasn't particularly clear. So we had a period of trying to decipher what exactly the guidance meant, and then you would then maybe have several clarifications as things moved on. But by and large, I think most people, having had a full year to deal with it in some shape or form, will be reasonably well placed to know the latest. And I suppose just in terms of the latest, I saw an interesting statistic just in terms of the scale of this scheme. By the middle of February, there have been over 50 billion in claims claimed by employers. So this has been an unprecedented scheme, and there has been a serious amount of support. Now, query, how long can that support last? At the minute, we're saying 30th of September. Personally, I think we will probably find that will be it. But as again, the guidance on this changes weekly in some cases, so we'll have to wait and see on that side of things. But I suppose it was probably just important to touch on some of the changes that came in January before moving into the latest iteration. So in January, from the 26th of January specifically, we had confirmation that HMRC would now publish a list of employers who were claiming under the furlough scheme with identifying information, in some cases company numbers, and also an indication of the bands, or sorry, the amount of support they were claiming within a band. And while there is some scope to petition HMRC as to why your information shouldn't be published, that is in practice very limited. I mean, it really only pertains to situations where there would potentially be a risk of harm if certain details were published. I think in most cases that won't apply. But I guess the whole point of this publishing of information sort of goes back to the government's desire to make this entirely transparent, and I suppose it's potentially a deterrent in terms of making fraudulent claims. You will be named, and in the case of a fraudulent claim, you will be shamed. And then also in January, we had confirmation from the government that employees who, by reason of COVID, had caring responsibilities, could be furloughed. Previously, it wasn't clear what caring responsibilities looked like, and then we had a bit of a confirmation that actually what was meant by that was employees who perhaps had to look after school-aged children because schools or childcare facilities were closed, could be furloughed because those responsibilities had come about purely because of COVID measures. But even then, going back to the fact that guidance isn't always totally clear, what wasn't clear at that point was whether this would apply to parents of secondary school-aged children, for example. Obviously appreciating that a very young child will require a lot more care, certainly in principle, than a teenager, for example, who may need less supervision. Now, as a parent of 3 children, I'm not sure how that actually operates in practice. I think it's fairly subjective, but again, that was a bit more confirmation we got. And then again, as I'd said at the start, we got to the point of the budget, and the Chancellor confirmed that the scheme would now be extended to 30th of September 2021. And I suppose probably the most important aspect of that, and I should say, look, the rules remain largely the same, but we've seen this reintroduction of the tapering scheme in terms of employer contributions. And what that looks like is demonstrate on the slide. But essentially, the position at the minute until June will be that the government will continue to pay up to 80% of wages up to the cap of £2,500 per employee, and those are for hours that the employee does not work. And currently at the minute, the government also pays employer national insurance contributions and pension contributions. So for now, employers are not actually required to pay anything. That will then change. So in July, we will see a slight decrease on the point of the government's contributions. That will drop to 70%. And employers will then have to pay employers' national insurance and pension contributions and then contribute a further 10% of wages. So it never gets past the 80% total cap, but it just slightly shifts. And then for the what is assumed to be the final month, you will see a drop again. The government dropping to 60%, employers up to 20%. So again, never past the 80%, but potentially a significant lift for employers. And as it says at the bottom of the slide there, employers pay employers' national insurance contributions and pension contributions throughout. And that really is just to reflect the fact that actually at the minute, you should be doing that anyway for hours that are worked, regardless of whatever you are claiming on furlough. But actually from July, you'll then have to pay those for the furloughed hours as well. And then just moving on, we have a bit more detail in terms of who can and can't be claimed for. So the rules at the minute say that flexible furlough is still an option. You can have employees full-time furloughed or flexibly furloughed, where they are perhaps working in reduced hours, rota, for example. You don't have to have used furlough previously. In a previous iteration, there was a cutoff point where employers had to have made a claim for employees in order to continue to do so. That has gone. Essentially, as long as you meet the eligibility criteria, you will be able to make a claim. The top point on the slide, though, I should clarify, for employees who joined between October 2020 and March 2021, the first time that they can be, or the first time a claim can be put through for those individuals is May 2021. And then I suppose just to caveat the fact that you can't claim for employees who joined on or after the 3rd of March 2021. And again, this is where we have a slight difficulty in that the government is saying, it was felt there was a need to extend the scheme, but yet there's also this bar on the most recent joiners signing up to it. I suppose perhaps the rationale for that is that if you are lucky enough to be in a position to be taking on new staff, you are hopefully not in a position of having to furlough them. I'm not sure in reality how that pans out across all industries and sectors, but that is the position. And again, just at the bottom there, as I've touched on, employees with caring responsibilities due to COVID-19, that has been confirmed that they can be placed on furlough, but it's worth noting that the employer will retain discretion on that, and we'll touch on that a bit more as the presentation goes on. So having set out some of the points in terms of the logistics of the scheme, I think it's probably worth touching on the issues that we foresee. And to be honest, most of those haven't changed, despite the fact that the scheme, the rules have changed. And I suppose the first point is probably the most important, and that's, will employers be able to make the increased contributions from July? So as I say, at the minute, they don't actually contribute anything. But then we will return to this tapered system, which was actually in place at the end of the summer last year. And we saw a fairly significant drop in the number of furlough claims. And there was a suggestion that that was because employers were either unable or perhaps unwilling to make the contribution elements. I suspect we may see another situation as we move towards August and September, where it simply isn't financially viable for employers to keep certain employees on furlough. And as it says on the slide, we may well see the next phase of things where we are looking at fairly large scale restructuring and redundancy exercises. I suppose just on the point of being able to make increased contributions, I was looking at a statistic recently there where it said that actually staff at small firms of between 2 to 4 employees are the most likely to be furloughed at the minute, with around about 36% of eligible staff furloughed. Conversely, for large companies with more than 250 employees, it's actually only about 9% of eligible staff are furloughed at the minute. So we have a situation where, and I'm sure you've seen in the press, some large-scale companies, household names, have previously paid back furlough cash and essentially said, look, we've actually done better than we expected, and we will hand the money back. But the reality is, for all but the biggest of employers, it isn't financially viable to do that. And so I think small to mid-sized employers especially may find that this obligation to make contributions will actively decide for them whether or not they actually can continue with furlough or not, or whether they need to move into this next stage of, okay, what is the end game here? Are these jobs viable? Are they not? And then again, touched on the childcare arrangements for those with COVID responsibilities, but it's worth noting that those kind of responsibilities continue regardless of COVID. You're always going to see issues around last minute childcare hiccups or sickness or things like that. What you may see is that employees will come to you, often at short notice, as is the way of the world, and say, well, this has come up. Is there any chance you can, flexibly furlough me for a short period of time? And while there is no minimum limit in terms of a flexible furlough agreement, there is a minimum term in terms of the period you can claim for. At the minute, that's 7 consecutive days. So again, it's probably something where best practice is to deal with these things on a case-by-case basis. But again, it may fluctuate, and it may be that you are able to accept some and not accept others, which then leads into a whole range of issues as well. That last point, how will furlough interact with vaccination status? And we will move on to the vaccine aspect in the second half of the presentation, but there is the potential for a crossover and related issues. And I've said, listen, keeping unvaccinated employees on furlough presents issues, absolutely. But you may find that, while there has been an increased rollout of the vaccine, the likelihood is that, given that the Chancellor has extended furlough to September, there is an acceptance that this is not a quick fix, and that really the expectation is that furlough will be open and claims will continue right up to the deadline, as it is assumed to be at the end of September. I don't think we're going to see a situation where you see a sudden drop off of furlough claims simply because vaccination numbers have gone up, but also you have situations where potentially younger members of your workforce are disadvantaged because, through no fault of their own, they can't get vaccinated anytime soon, just because of the way the programs are working at the minute. So they are potentially disadvantaged, and you could find yourself on the wrong end of a discrimination claim if you decide to roll out a sort of a blanket return to work for those who've been vaccinated, but yet keeping those who haven't on furlough. I suspect that would definitely be met with challenge, and certainly wouldn't be something that we advise you to do. So that was the first half on furlough, and I suppose that was with an eye on what is being done at the minute to sort of stave off any immediate redundancies and a hope of prolonging jobs until we can get ourselves in a situation where we have a return to normality as such. And this second half is with an eye on a return to work. Fingers crossed in the near future. Certainly, as it says at the top of the slide there, the vaccine rollout, especially in Northern Ireland, has been remarkably positive. From the 10th of March, or sort of as of the 10th of March, there had been just over 600,000 people in Northern Ireland who had had at least their first dose of a vaccine, which equates to about 32% of the population. Now, obviously, Northern Ireland, relatively small population, but I think there was an acceptance, certainly in the rest of the UK, if not worldwide, that the Northern Ireland was leading the way in terms of vaccine. And I think those figures are not anywhere near as close in the rest of GB, for example. So, employers could be forgiven for thinking, great, a return to work is on the cards, maybe sooner than we thought. And you obviously have the sort of roadmap out of lockdown as well, which is running in parallel. And as restrictions ease there, the desire may be to get back in to the workplace and get things moving and get back to normal, as it were, as soon as possible. In principle, that's all great. It is absolutely a positive that the vaccine is being rolled out quickly and relatively efficiently from what we've seen. But on that point, as always, there are always going to be potential issues and pitfalls and things to be mindful of before you sort of go full steam ahead into your return. And what I'll do now is just touch on some of those. And listen, there are a whole range of considerations. This is not something that has been tested extensively. So it's something that will, as again with furlough guidance, we think the guidance will change fairly quickly on this. But also it means that issues that perhaps weren't immediately identifiable will crop up. I read a thing in the news there over the weekend, a case where a clinically vulnerable young man in England with learning disabilities had been essentially, it went to court because the health trust responsible for his care was of the view that he was in an extremely clinically vulnerable category, and actually he was in a priority category for receiving the vaccine, so they thought he should have it. But his parents, as his carers, were against the idea. His father in particular made a fairly strong argument in terms of he didn't want his son receiving a vaccine that was essentially untested. Now, ultimately, the judge sided with the health trust and said, look, on balance, yes, we think he should have this. But it's, again, a highlight that these things will develop, and you may well find cases where the reverse is true. So it's something to be mindful of. And also, even just recently, we saw that the Republic of Ireland, for example, has placed a temporary suspension on the use of the AstraZeneca vaccine. And that was coming out of some anomalies that had been seen in Norway through the use of that vaccine. Northern Ireland hasn't followed suit, but things like this will continue to crop up, and guidance and best practice will change as they do. But again, as always with these things, I think they will be approached on a case-by-case basis. Just going back to the slide, one of the most common queries that we are seeing, certainly at our end, is this question of, can I make it mandatory that my employees get vaccinated? By and large, the answer is no, you can't. But listen, obviously, for certain sectors, mandatory vaccination requirements are nothing new. Healthcare primarily, there are certain vaccinations as a frontline healthcare worker that you essentially have to get, things like hepatitis B, for example. So that is part and parcel of the role, albeit again, that's a frontline worker. Clerical staff in the NHS will not necessarily be expected to get those. So while it is, part and parcel of the role in certain sectors, as it says on the slide there, it's going to be much more problematic for others. The non-traditional sectors who have never had to deal with things like this before. And And that's really where we get into the second part. And we certainly see this as an employee engagement piece. So while you by and large will not be able to make it a mandatory requirement to get vaccinated, you can also do the sort of PR piece around signposting the benefits. So it's a sort of an employee discussion piece. You can encourage uptake, but then you have the other edge of the sword where you can also highlight implications for certain roles and in certain sectors where if an employee refuses to get vaccinated, for example, there may be repercussions in terms of their employment. Now that may then you may find yourself in a case where you are potentially facing unfair or constructive unfair dismissal claims or even discrimination claims. So again, it's this piece of engaging early with employees and setting out why you feel that actually for your particular sector or your industry, the job role that they're doing specifically, it is important that they get it. But also acknowledging that there may be repercussions down the line if you don't. Ultimately, it becomes individual choice whether they are willing to do that or not. But you should really be in a position to clearly objectively justify why it is you think employees should do this. And I suppose I touched on that next point in terms of potential for claims. Yes, there are potential claims for unfair dismissal, constructive unfair dismissal, but actually the one you're most likely to face and we think will be sort of more in scope are your discrimination claims. So where someone feels they have been discriminated against because of a protected characteristic, for example. The most likely ones, again, given the way the vaccine is being rolled out, age, so younger employees, for example, who just through no fault of their own will not be able to get the vaccine anytime soon. And then you have others who, for example, because of a pre-existing medical condition, may have been advised not to get it. We've seen cases where if employees are on medication, for example, their GP or their doctor has told them, look, your medication is not compatible with the vaccine, so you can't get it at the minute. Or pregnant mothers, for example, or you may have a situation where because of an employee's religious belief, it may not be compatible with getting the vaccine. So it's probably just worth saying there is no one size fits all blanket approach to how you approach this. And as best as possible, it's probably a case by case basis approach. And then that last point there, just how do we think this will interact with the furlough scheme in the short term? Again, the furlough scheme will continue to run to September. Vaccination rollout is increasing fairly rapidly, so in Northern Ireland certainly, but they will likely go hand in hand right up to September, and so you may have a situation where certain employees are coming back off furlough, either willing to get vaccinated or have got vaccinated, or haven't yet had the opportunity or are unwilling to. And you may find yourself in a situation where you think, great, let's bring back everybody that has been vaccinated. But again, in doing so, you may expose yourself to problems. There's probably not there's not one single answer, which is the best way of dealing with those issues. It really is going to be a case by case, and I appreciate that's not the answer that people want to hear, but it sort of harks back to that. Look, this is, if nothing else, the last sort of year has taught business, the need to be flexible and certainly not make assumptions on things. That continues to be our advice, certainly in this area. And then there are other points to consider. Again, just because the vaccine is becoming increasingly available and numbers are increasing, that is not a reason for employers to suddenly say, great, we'll move straight to a return to work. Your existing health and safety measures, they're in place for a reason. They shouldn't just drop off because a vaccine is suddenly available. And again, if you bring back a certain cohort or you bring everybody back, there will be individuals who may have existing health conditions, others who are more vulnerable than others. You may have individuals who are just nervous about a return to work, and so they will be, wanting to see health and safety measures, continuing, and that is your responsibility as an employer to make sure those are done. What we sort of advise is that, look, you almost certainly have risk assessments in terms of employees coming into work at the minute, things like wearing of masks, social distancing, things like that. Keep those in place, keep them under review. But in terms of the vaccine, put in a section in your risk assessment in terms of how you're going to deal with, again, those who maybe are vaccinated, those who aren't, or outliers who simply refuse because if nothing else, you may well see a situation where an employee will quite happily voluntarily take the vaccine, but they don't like the idea of their employer telling them to do so. And you may get into problems there where an employee insists on coming into work when they've essentially been advised, look, don't if you haven't been vaccinated yet, or alternatively, we may insist that actually if you're coming into work, you have to have a COVID test before you can set foot on the floor plate, for example. Most reasonable individuals will have no issues with that, but again, there are always outliers, and those are just things to be mindful of. As I'd said previously, like a blanket approach just should be avoided. There's no sense in creating problems for yourself by sticking to a rigid one-size-fits-all approach, because it just will not work in this situation. The next point is something that certainly I know some businesses will have looked at, and that's commercial sourcing of the vaccine. And said there, that raises questions in terms of, are you taking away from stocks that are then available for the NHS, for example? I had read a piece, it was actually last year, where there was a members club in London was arranging for members to fly out to Dubai, I think it was, and receive the vaccine privately. And this was, part and parcel of the members fee that they were paying. Quite a novel approach. You can't knock the entrepreneurial spirit there, but I think there's a wider piece around, is that really ethical? It's a bit of a conundrum, as an employer, if you could offer this service to your employees, why wouldn't you? But then by the same token, you could go out, source the vaccine at considerable expense, and then when you try and offer it to employees, you find yourself in a situation where actually suddenly the majority are coming saying, well, I don't want that, thank you very much. So it's ethically questionable, and also a bit of a wasted enterprise in terms of outlay. And then just that last point, again, this is one that hasn't been tested in case law, certainly that I have seen so far. But if you, this is more about if you try to push through mandatory vaccination, but even if you reasonably signpost that and suggest this would be beneficial to you, if an employee then decides, okay, I will get the vaccine, and they suffer a reaction, an allergic reaction, for example, potentially you as the employer could be exposed to your personal injury claim. And I suppose that's something that maybe employers haven't actually put too much thought into. Again, it will invariably come down to the mindset of the individual employee. Some will just chalk it up as bad luck. Others will, rightly be aggrieved and want to pursue it. So it's just, again, something to be considerate of if you are weighing up, look, how forcefully do we push this with the employees, and do we try and make it mandatory or not? With everything around vaccines, it's not clear, it's not black and white, and essentially you just have to try and do the best you can as guidance develops. And then finally, I just want to move into some of the next steps, certainly as we see them. And again, listen, I know I've majored on this, but guidance in both areas, furlough and vaccination status, subject to frequent change. As best you can, stay on top of it. Like I said at the start, in terms of furlough, certainly what we're seeing is that most employers are on top of it. While there was an initial burst of queries this time last year, the position has kind of settled, and it's really just a case of keeping on top of what the general guidance is, and then as best you can applying it to the exact circumstances you're facing in the workforce. And then that second point, look, the furlough scheme will end eventually. And what we're advising employers to do is, at this point in time, assume that it will be September. Of course, it could change, but really now what we are thinking it will be is a case of, plan for that September cliff edge, and if unfortunately it looks like you may have to do a restructuring or redundancy exercise, start getting those ducks in a row now, because while the scheme, was designed to avoid those things, ultimately, that may not be the reality. With the best will in the world, for whatever reason, you may find a situation where job roles just simply aren't viable anymore, or as a business, you may have spent the last year adapting your practices because of COVID, and find yourselves in a situation where actually we have potentially moved away from a certain work stream, or we've diversified and we want to take our interest in another area, and just by virtue of that, we have a situation where there is a reduced need for staff. It's best to approach those matters now, and have a roadmap essentially, rather than finding yourself on the 1st of October suddenly going, okay, what do we do now? The support is gone. Employers or employees, are knocking on your door saying, what happens now? Do we come back to work? Do we not? So again, it's as best you can, taking those steps to prepare now. And then just that next one, again, as best you can, be live to employee views on any sort of push towards a requirement for vaccination. That's not to say you listen to each and every single criticism or sort of query that comes to your door, but if you have employee forums or you have a union recognition in place, I think it's best to try and broach these things early. Certainly set out your stall in terms of why you think it would benefit employees in your particular area, but also give them the opportunity to get their views across and ask questions. And like I said earlier, it may ultimately come down to a situation where the employee is faced with the choice of getting it or not, and dealing with the repercussions as they may come. I suppose finally, as with all things, and as we would say as lawyers, if you're not sure, do seek advice. While there is now an abundance of guidance out there, the reality is that oftentimes it isn't particularly clear. And so through no fault of your own, you could find yourself in a situation where you've perhaps wrongly interpreted eligibility for a furlough claim, for example, or you may have got your contributions wrong because of a date cutoff or things like that. Again, if you're unsure, seek legal advice on this, and by and large, that will keep you right. I appreciate that was a fairly rapid run through, a lot to digest, and I can see there are a couple of questions in the Q&A box there. So look, as best as possible, we'll try and answer some of those now. I think actually we've a fair bit of time left.
Thank you, Rob. That was a great insight. Thank you so much. I'll maybe just kick it off first, and we've got some questions coming through, as you said there. Just, is it possible to run a redundancy process while the furlough scheme is ongoing?
It is. Now, it's obviously not ideal, certainly if individuals are on furlough, or even just working from home at the minute in terms of any consultation requirements there are. But it is possible to do consultation, be it by video conference, Zoom, for example, or even just in writing. it is more than likely to be challenged by an employee, certainly who is sitting on furlough at the minute. They would perhaps quite reasonably say, well, is furlough not a reasonable alternative to redundancy at the minute? But again, as an employer, you are not obliged to keep somebody on furlough just to avoid the inevitable. And as long as you can give an objective justification for the reason, a tribunal will not dig too deeply into that. I suppose it's worth noting, previously employers were able to claim for the parts of an employee's notice that were spent on furlough. They now can't do that. So since December last year, you can't claim for any days where an employee is serving their contractual or statutory notice. And if you do move to a situation to make employees redundant, in terms of statutory redundancy payments and notice pay, that should be based on their normal wage pre-furlough, as opposed to the reduced furlough rates.
There's one actually linked here to this as well, just following a wee bit further on to that. If there's no more work for that employee and they're going to be made redundant, should they start the redundancy process now, or should the employee be allowed to continue to have the benefit of furlough?
Again, from the employee's point of view, they will almost certainly argue, and certainly we think where there's union representation, they will strongly argue they should be allowed to stay on furlough as long as possible. That, with the best will in the world, the employer is not obliged to do that. If coming down the track you're saying, look, this role is no longer viable, it essentially exists in a bubble, which is furlough. But once furlough goes, that role is gone. Like I said, it makes sense to take steps to do that now, and especially for smaller employers, as the obligation to start making incremental contributions creeps up. It just may not be financially viable to do that, to keep employees on furlough, and so then you're faced with a case of get your house in order now. As disappointing as that may be to employees, and like I said, you're probably likely to face challenge. It all comes down to that justification that, look, this is the way the business is heading, and as long as you can stand over that, there really shouldn't be any issues.
Okay, I've got a practical one here. Can employers claim NIC and pension costs for employees currently on furlough?
They can for hours that aren't worked. But for any hours that are worked, you should be paying those.
Okay. In terms of the current work from home instructions, if these are relaxed by the government and employees are allowed to work from the office, but an employee refuses to come back into the office, can employers force them to come back in?
Again, this is where you will potentially run into issues, because it almost comes down to the individual you're dealing with. Now, you can take steps to show them that you are taking all precautions in terms of health and safety steps, social distancing, mask wearing, things like that. But if an individual may have had COVID previously, or has an underlying health condition and is rightly nervous about returning to work, it's sort of a tread carefully message. Obviously, if you are satisfied that, look, we've done our utmost here to make the workplace safe, and it isn't viable for you to continue to work at home, we really need you back. Arguably, if you're asking them to come back and they are refusing, and you don't think their reason for refusing is merited, they are potentially failing to comply with a reasonable instruction, which is return to work. And in that case, you may find that actually they are liable to disciplinary action. Now, nobody really wants to go down that road, but it's something to certainly consider. Again, though, it really comes down to that engagement piece with the individual, understanding what their concerns are, and as best as possible, try and alleviate those. Again, though, in certain circumstances, you will not be able to, and so you may find that actually you have to move and follow a process.
Is there much evidence of HMRC challenging furlough claims to date?
Not to date. He says with
long
a
way
laugh.
to go.
Yes, listen, there is a long way to go, and again, with the best will in the world, the sheer volume of the amount claimed, over £50 billion. Logic says there will be a couple of unscrupulous claims in there, but where do you even start if you're HMRC? Rather unfairly, I suspect they will start with the larger employers. And again, details are published in those sort of banded areas. So, they may well cherry pick, they may well audit and say, okay, we'll look at some of the biggest claims and do a deep dive. We haven't seen it in practice, but it would not surprise me if, cynically, they then look to recover some of this massive spend down the line.
Yeah. This might be a bit dependent on the situation, but what's the likelihood of success of claims against a company that were infected at work?
Infected with COVID? Again, I think
very dependent.
Yeah, I mean, it comes down to what you're doing at the minute. Certainly in our workplace, we are by and large, working from home. We can come into the office if we need to. Certain aspects of our role just simply you cannot do at home. If you're preparing for court and physical documents are in the office and you have to get in and get them, there is an acceptance that you may need to do that. But at the same time, we are told, if you're moving between floors, wear a mask. There are sanitizer stations every sort of 10 meters. It's reinforced. Here are the steps we're putting in place to protect you. Please also engage. And again, it's very subjective. I think again you might fall into a trap where if you are advising employees to stay at home if they're exhibiting symptoms and an employee decides, well, I'm just going to come in anyway, short of them saying I have symptoms, how are you to know? And also how really can you prove that it happened in the workplace? So I suppose the long and short of it, I think it would be fairly low unless an employee could actually show, look, here's why it happened, or here's why I think it happened, and actually, lo and behold, my employer isn't putting any steps in place. Now, again, if that's the case, query, why would you come in the first place? Why run the risk?
Yeah. You mentioned in your presentation the mandatory vaccine program. Can an offer of employment be conditional on the individual proving that they have received a COVID vaccine?
Potentially. No, I appreciate that's a bit of a cop-out. But I think potentially yes. Again, it will come down to sector and specific job role and need, for example. But this isn't the same as an employee proving a right to work, for example. That is a legal obligation on employers to stop illegal working, for example. So it's totally credible for you to say, before you take up employment with us, you must show you can work. There's no issue with that. In this case, again, you potentially open yourself to discrimination claims. Now, albeit if a candidate hasn't actually accepted an offer or started work, you're not going to face an unfair dismissal claim, but you could conceivably find yourself on the end of a discrimination claim where someone says, well, I can't do that right now because of an existing medical condition, or I am at the very end of the queue in terms of when I will have the ability to get the vaccine. So through no fault of my own, I'm the best candidate on paper. You've told me I'm the best candidate, but I can't actually take up this employment. How is that fair? Now, again, it will be difficult for an individual to prove discrimination, but I think certainly, jobs are thin on the ground at the minute. So we think there'll probably be an increase in speculative claims, even with a view to ultimately settling them before it goes to tribunal and landing with a bit of money in your pocket. So yes, look, it is potentially doable if you are in a sector that maybe has had a high instance of COVID cases in the workplace. You can again look to justify it, but again, it may be met with individual challenge.
Okay, no, that's great. So I'm conscious of time here and that people probably want to get a coffee before their next Zoom call, so we'll maybe just close it off there. Thank you, Rob, for taking the time out today. I really appreciate all those insights, and thank you for all of you coming on today as well, and please do look out for any upcoming events we have on. I hope to maybe see you all soon, maybe in person if the vaccination programme remains successful. But in the meantime, thank you.
No problem. Thank you.